almost a truism that Trump's dealings with the media are Nixonian. What do people mean by that?
Right. Richard Nixon was really the first modern American politician to frame the press as, in Trump's terms, an enemy of the people. You know, he didn't use those terms publicly. Privately, of course, he did even worse, but he might as well have, right? And the idea that, well, this is how his vice president put it in a very famous speech in 1969. That's kind of a difference between Trump and Nixon. Nixon kind of sent out surrogates to do the really nasty stuff publicly. You know, it was a real big watershed in November of 1969 when Richard Nixon was so angry at all three networks for doing immediate response to a big Vietnam speech he did in November of 1969. That was the famous silent majority speech, that he just decided it was time to go nuclear. And it was actually Pat Buchanan's idea to send out Spiro Agnew, who was this vice president who really had no public profile whatsoever until this point. But he gave this speech that basically got covered live. He guilted the White House guilted all three networks into covering it live, right? Mm-hmm. So using that sort of manipulation of the press in order to attack the press. And he criticized, and I'm quoting here, a small band of network commentators and self-appointed analysts, the majority of whom expressed in one way or another their hostility to what he had to say. It was obvious that their minds were made up in advance, which, of course, wasn't obvious. Now I want to make myself perfectly clear. I'm not asking for government censorship or any other kind of censorship. I'm asking whether a form of censorship already exists when the news that 40 million Americans receive each night is determined by a handful of men responsible only to their corporate employers and is filtered through a handful of commentators who admit to their own set of biases. So this was, kind of brewing for a long time. The coverage of the riots at the Democratic Convention the previous summer, were criticized in much the same terms. But wasn't that a clever formulation, right? That it's
there's certainly a grain of truth in it, that there really is a corporate elite and that it is very cozy with power brokers.
Right. And, this is, again, the big difference between how the Nixon White House did things and the Trump White House did things was the Nixon White House was able to frame things that just got so much more leverage from this kind of anger. But with Richard Nixon, of course, it goes back quite a bit further than that. He was always angry that this so-called media elite sided with Alger Hiss, right, who was the very distinguished State Department official who was accused of being a communist in the 1940s. And Richard Nixon, as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, investigated him, eventually got him to commit perjury. Remember, the perjury trap is always a big one. And so the Hiss Chambers case was kind of like the big political melodrama of the 1940s. And he had decided way back then that the liberals and the press and the liberals and the press and the press who were liberal would never forgive him for that. And, even though he, in a lot of ways, throughout his career, was a media darling. Certainly in the pages of the Los Angeles Times, which was a very powerful newspaper in Southern California where he came up. But in 1962, when he lost the governor's race, they covered him in a much more objective way. They covered him basically fairly instead of leaning on the scales in his favor. And he was so disillusioned by this that he gave a very famous speech after he lost in 1962. He was drunk. He had just, lost the governor's race 2 years after losing the presidential race. And his press secretary begged him to go down and at least give some kind of concession statement, which is supposed to be gracious. But instead, he very famously said, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. I hope the press recognize that they have a right and responsibility. If they're against the candidate, give him the shaft," which was very foul stuff for the time. But also recognize if they give him the shaft, put one lonely reporter on the campaign who will report what the candidate says now and then. So, he was onto something, right? He was onto something that a lot of people in the 1960s, in which, the fashionable way the wind was blowing was in the direction of these sort of basically movements of liberation that in a lot of ways were challenging the ways of thinking of middle America, and that the press seemed to be on the side of these liberation movements, which was very alienating for the people that Richard Nixon labeled the silent majority, who really felt condescended to, that their values were not considered moral anymore, that the moral people were the people who were, causing these disruptions. So he had something very potent. And of course, he wasn't the only person during this period who was making these gestures, but he was the best and he was the most effective, and he influenced basically every conservative politician since.
And it is interesting how that kind of rhetoric of condescension comes in. It's so frustrating and potent because there are fundamental moral disagreements in our society, and yet one side has decided that criticism is automatically condescending.
Right. And in a way, this gets to some very kind of basic, kind of almost cognitively ingrained ways of thinking that determine whether you're a left-wing person or a right-wing person, right? I mean, if the press in an Enlightenment-based society is all about telling truth to power, it's a disruptive force. Right. And if you're a person who, values stability over disruption, then you're going to feel condescended to by people who think that your very longing for stability is somehow morally suspect.
But how do we bring that out into a healthier kind of dialogue in which people can say, well, I value stability and that's a thing and I'm prepared to argue for it, and you're going to argue for a change in confrontation, and we can actually exchange ideas productively instead of them feeling like they're being condescended to?
Well, I think in a sense, it's structurally very difficult, if not impossible, for people who basically believe, all is well in the world and have a Panglossian view of certainly America, to be thinking about a mode of citizenship and patriotism which demands more accountability for America. And to me, the lesson for journalists, for reporters, for commentators is, as I always put it, tell the truth as you see it without fear or favor, and devil take the hindmost. And basically put up the fact that there's really no way that if you're doing your job right, you're not going to get that charge hurled at you, and not to be, not to negotiate with yourself and not to be intimidated by that fact, that that's just a natural part of being a truth teller, and that truth telling in that sense is an enlightenment value that will always be a challenging thing to people whose values are different than the Enlightenment.
One of the really disturbing things about Trump is that he seems to have these sort of paramilitaries online, and actual budding paramilitaries in the streets to enforce his will against journalists and anybody else who crosses him. Did Nixon have those kinds of rank and file operatives out in the world enforcing his will, or is this a new development?
No, he actually did have basically thugs doing that kind of intimidation for him, whether it was a physical intimidation. In the case of, there was recently a memo that was kind of brought to prominence. I think it might have been discovered in the archives, but it didn't basically say anything that we didn't already know, that he was sending out people to rough up people like Daniel Ellsberg, who, wasn't necessarily a journalist, but he was persona non grata because he had, leaked the Pentagon Papers to journalists.
He was journalist adjacent.
Right. He was journalist adjacent. So, in that case, it was outright physical thuggery. But he also, Richard Nixon, had a political enforcer named Chuck Colson, who was a really nasty guy. He said he would run over his own grandmother to reelect Richard Nixon. I mean, that's a quote, who was doing things like showing up in the offices of William Paley, who was the CEO of CBS, and basically intimidating him with the power of the White House. He was going to people like Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, and threatening the Post with losing their licenses, which were very lucrative, to operate local television stations if they didn't play ball. And very early in the presidential term of Richard Nixon in 1969, one of his then White House officials, who later became a re-election campaign official who went to jail, Jeb Stuart Magruder, for Watergate, wrote a very detailed memo. It's called the Shotgun and Rifle Memo, in which he laid out basically 12 ways to use the power of the executive branch to intimidate the press. And we had Roger Ailes, who also was a Nixon operative, who was talking about coming up with some sort of independent media infrastructure that was loyal to the White House. And we had Patrick Buchanan, right, who's been playing this game for a very, very long time. And of course started his career as a journalist, as an editorial writer, although one who was also a conduit for smears from J. Edgar Hoover against people like Martin Luther King. Pat Buchanan, was talking about the same thing. We need to come up with our own think tanks. We need to come up with our own media institutions. So whether it was physical intimidation, which we see evidence of from the Nixon White House, or call it bureaucratic or legal intimidation, this was serious business, and it wasn't invented by Donald J. Trump.